The orbital station called Harmony's Gate floated in the darkness of space like a massive jewel. Its lights twinkled against the endless black void, making it look almost magical. This wasn't just any space station. It was neutral territory, a place where different empires and civilizations could meet without fear of war or betrayal. Tonight, it was hosting one of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. Empress Thera of the Velcorian Empire had arrived with her full entourage. 17 star systems bowed to her command. Billions of lives depended on her decisions. She ruled with absolute authority, and everyone feared her. Well, almost everyone. The restaurant chosen for tonight's diplomatic dinner was human-owned and operated. The Velcorians had insisted on neutral ground, and the humans had offered this upscale establishment as a gesture of goodwill. Empress Thera sat at the center table, her back straight as a steel rod, wearing ceremonial robes that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Her skin had a silver tone that reflected the soft ambient lighting, making her look almost ethereal, but her eyes were cold, calculating, measuring everything and everyone around her. Around the table, diplomats from both Earth and Velcora engaged in careful conversation. They talked about trade routes that would benefit both civilizations. They discussed resource-sharing agreements. They debated shipping schedules and tariff rates. The conversation was polite, formal, and incredibly boring. Empress Thera barely paid attention to any of it. Her advisors would handle the details later. She was only here because protocol demanded it. To Empress Thera, humans were little more than children playing at civilization. They were too emotional, wearing their feelings on their faces for everyone to see. They were unpredictable, making decisions based on things like compassion and sentiment rather than cold logic. They were soft, building societies that protected the weak instead of eliminating them. In her view, humanity had gotten lucky in their expansion through space. They didn't deserve their success. Beside the Empress sat her daughter, Princess Mira. The girl sat motionless in a specialized mobility chair, her hands folded in her lap. She was young, perhaps 16 in human years, with the same silver-toned skin as her mother. But where Empress Thera radiated power and authority, Princess Mira seemed almost invisible. She stared down at her hands, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Princess Mira had been born with a degenerative neural condition. The disease affected her motor functions, leaving her unable to walk. Her speech was severely limited, with most words requiring tremendous effort to form. In Velcorian culture, any form of disability was seen as a genetic weakness, a flaw that threatened the purity of their species. Most noble families would have hidden such a child away in some remote medical facility, never to be seen in public again. But Empress Thera refused to do that. Despite the pressure from her council, despite the whispers from other noble houses, she brought Mira to state functions. The girl was her daughter, and she would not be ashamed of her. However, that didn't mean the situation wasn't painful. Every public appearance was a reminder that her empire saw Mira as damaged goods, unfit to inherit the throne. The Empress noticed the human staff glancing at her daughter throughout the evening. She braced herself for the usual reactions. Some beings looked at Mira with pity, their eyes full of sadness and sympathy that felt like insults. Others showed discomfort, quickly looking away as if disability might be contagious. Many simply pretended not to notice, carefully averting their eyes and acting as if the princess didn't exist at all. But one waiter was different. He was a young human man, probably in his mid-20s, with an average build and an honest face. His name tag identified him as Tyler. He had been serving their section of the restaurant all evening, bringing drinks and appetizers, clearing plates, always professional and courteous. What caught the Empress's attention was how Tyler looked at Princess Mira. There was no pity in his eyes, no discomfort, no carefully practiced avoidance. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious, studying the princess the way someone might observe an interesting piece of art or a puzzle they want to solve. His expression was open, friendly, and completely without judgment. Empress Thera filed this observation away in her mind as an oddity, nothing more. Humans were strange creatures with strange customs. Perhaps this was just another example of their bizarre, emotional nature. She returned her attention to the negotiations happening around her. One of her senior diplomats was discussing mineral rights in a disputed asteroid belt. A human representative was countering with concerns about environmental impact. The conversation droned on, technical and tedious. Empress Thera checked the chronometer on her wrist display. 3 more hours. She had to endure 3 more hours of this tedious dinner before she could return to her flagship and leave this primitive station behind. 3 more hours of pretending humans were worth her time. 3 more hours of watching her daughter sit in silence, isolated and alone even in a crowded room. The Empress had no way of knowing that these 3 hours would change everything. She couldn't predict that the curious young waiter would do something that would shake the foundations of her empire. She had no idea that by the end of this evening, she would question every belief she had ever held about strength, weakness, and what it truly meant to rule. Sometimes, the most important moments in history start quietly, with nothing more than a kind glance from a stranger. The dinner service had reached a quiet moment. Most of the main courses had been delivered, and the diplomats were deep in conversation about some technical matter involving cargo inspections. The restaurant staff moved efficiently between tables, refilling drinks and clearing plates. Everything was running smoothly, professionally, just as it should. That's when Tyler made his move. He walked toward the royal table with a confidence that seemed almost reckless. The moment he got within 10 feet of Princess Mira, Empress Thera's personal guards went on high alert. Their hands moved instinctively toward the weapons concealed beneath their formal uniforms. Their bodies tensed, ready to intercept any threat to the royal family. In Valkorian culture, approaching royalty without explicit permission was a serious offense, one that could result in immediate detention or worse. But Tyler didn't seem to notice or care about the danger he was putting himself in. He simply walked up to the princess's chair and did something completely unexpected. He knelt down slowly and deliberately until he was at her eye level, not standing above her looking down, not treating her like a child or an invalid, but meeting her as an equal. "Hi there," Tyler said softly, his voice gentle and warm. Then he did something that made Empress Thera's heart skip a beat. He lifted his hands and began to sign in Valkorian Sign Language. His movements were clumsy and imperfect, clearly showing he was still learning. His grammar was probably terrible, but the effort was unmistakable, and the sincerity behind it was even more obvious. "My name is Tyler," he signed slowly. "Do you like music?" Empress Thera felt her entire world tilt sideways. A human? Speaking their sign language? That was impossible. Valkorian Sign Language wasn't taught to outsiders. It was a private form of communication used mainly by their medical professionals and families dealing with speech disabilities. How could this random human waiter possibly know it? Princess Myra's reaction was even more dramatic. The girl's eyes went wide with shock and something else, something the Empress hadn't seen in her daughter's face for months, maybe years. Interest. Genuine, surprised interest. For a moment, Mira just stared at Tyler, as if trying to figure out whether this was real or some kind of elaborate joke. Then, slowly and painfully, she lifted one trembling hand. The effort was visible, her muscles fighting against her damaged nervous system with every movement. But she managed to form the signs clearly enough. "Yes," she signed back. Just one word, but it was enough. Tyler's face lit up with a brilliant smile. "Me too," he said, speaking out loud while also signing along. "My little sister back on Earth is deaf. I learned sign language so we could talk to each other. She taught me that music is universal. You know, it doesn't need words. It speaks directly to your heart." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small personal media device, the kind humans use to store their entertainment files. With a few quick touches on the screen, soft music began to play. It was an instrumental piece, something with strings and gentle percussion. There were no lyrics, no words in any language, just pure melody and emotion flowing through the air. Princess Myra's entire body responded to the music. Her breathing pattern changed, becoming slower and deeper. Her shoulders, which had been tense and rigid all evening, began to relax slightly. She swayed just a little bit, moving with the rhythm in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. And then her lips, those lips that rarely moved except during feeding or medical procedures, curved upward into something that almost resembled a smile. Empress Thera sat frozen in her chair, watching this impossible scene unfold. Her daughter, who barely responded to the Empire's finest physicians, who showed little reaction to the most advanced therapists and specialists, who seemed locked inside her own body most of the time, was connecting with this human stranger over a simple song. It didn't make sense. It defied everything she understood about Myra's condition, but she couldn't deny what she was seeing with her own eyes. Throughout the rest of the evening, Tyler kept returning to their table. He had other customers to serve, other duties to perform, but he always made time to check on Princess Mira. When he brought out the next course, he didn't just place the plates on the table and walk away. He described each dish with theatrical enthusiasm, using exaggerated gestures and animated expressions that made even the process of using Myra's feeding tube seem less clinical and more like a normal dining experience. This one has a spice blend from the southern continent, he explained, his hands painting pictures in the air. The chef says it tastes like sunshine and makes you feel warm inside, even on the coldest day. He asked Mira questions between his other duties. What were her favorite colors? Did she enjoy art? What kind of hobbies did she have? Each question was asked with genuine curiosity, not the condescending tone that adults sometimes use with children or people with disabilities. When Mira struggled to form her responses, Tyler waited patiently, treating each labored sign as if it were the most important information he'd heard all day. He never showed frustration when she took a long time to answer. He never tried to finish her sentences or guess what she was trying to say. He simply waited, giving her the space and time she needed to communicate in her own way. The Empress watched all of this with growing amazement. Tyler was treating her daughter like a person, not a burden, not a political problem, or a medical condition, or a shameful secret. Just a person who happened to communicate differently and move differently than others. Empress Thera realized she was witnessing something profound, something her entire civilization had somehow forgotten how to do. They had built an empire that spanned 17 star systems. They had mastered technology that allowed them to travel between worlds. They had created art and music and literature that was respected across the galaxy. But somewhere along the way, they had forgotten how to show simple kindness to those who needed it most. The diplomatic dinner was finally winding down. Most of the food had been eaten, though the Velcorians had only sampled small portions out of politeness. The diplomats were finishing their final discussions, wrapping up the technical details that would be formalized in contracts later. The evening was almost over, and Empress Thera was already planning her departure back to Flagship. That's when the music started. It came from somewhere else on the station, drifting through the air from an adjacent hall. The restaurant had transparent walls made of reinforced crystal, offering stunning views of space on one side and views of the station's interior on the other. Through one of those clear walls, the dinner guests could see into a large celebration hall where humans had gathered for some kind of party. It looked like a wedding, based on the decorations and the formal attire many of the guests were wearing. Or maybe it was a promotion ceremony, or perhaps just a regular social gathering. Humans seemed to need very little excuse to celebrate together. The hall was filled with people laughing, talking, and most importantly, dancing. Couples spun across the floor in each other's arms. Some moved with practiced grace, clearly knowing what they were doing. Others stumbled and laughed at their own mistakes, not caring about perfection, just enjoying the moment. The music was upbeat and joyful, the kind of melody that made you want to move even if you didn't know how to dance. Princess Myra's attention had been drawn to that hall. She sat in her mobility chair, her head turned as far as she could manage, watching the dancers through the transparent wall. Her eyes followed each couple as they moved, tracking their movements with an intensity that suggested she was trying to memorize every step, every gesture, every moment of connection between the dancers. The expression on her face was one of pure longing. It was a look of someone watching others experience something they desperately wanted but believed they could never have. The kind of expression that reaches into your chest and squeezes your heart until it hurts. Empress Thera saw that look and felt physical pain. This was her daughter, her only child, yearning for something as simple as a dance. Something that most beings took for granted. Something that should have been her birthright as a young woman, but that her condition had stolen from her. Tyler noticed it too. The young waiter had been clearing dishes from a nearby table when he glanced over and saw Princess Mira watching the dancers. He stood still for a moment, observing her expression, understanding what it meant. Then he made a decision that would change everything. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked straight toward the princess. He didn't ask permission from the Empress. He didn't consult with the guards or the diplomats. He didn't follow any protocol at all. What he was about to do was technically a serious breach of conduct, the kind of thing that could result in his immediate arrest or even deportation from the station. But Tyler didn't seem to care about any of that. "Princess Mira," he said gently, kneeling beside her chair once more. "Would you like to dance?" Empress Thera's mouth opened to refuse. Her mind raced through a dozen reasons why this was impossible. It was inappropriate for a common worker to touch royalty. It was dangerous, given her daughter's medical condition. It was impossible because Mira couldn't support her own weight, couldn't move the way dancers needed to move. But before she could voice any of those objections, she made the mistake of looking at her daughter's face. Hope, pure, blazing, desperate hope burned in Princess Myra's eyes. It was an expression the Empress hadn't seen in years, maybe had never seen with such intensity. Her daughter wanted this, wanted it with every fiber of her being. Myra's hand shook as she slowly raised it to sign her response. The movement took enormous effort, her damaged nervous system fighting her every inch of the way. But she managed to form the signs clearly. "Yes," she signed, then added with visible strain, "Please." Tyler smiled, that same warm, genuine smile he'd shown all evening. He moved with surprising competence, carefully releasing the safety restraints on Myra's mobility chair. These restraints were medical equipment, designed to keep the princess secure and safe. Tyler handled them like someone who understood what they were for, showing the kind of confidence that comes from experience. Then he lifted her, but the way he did was remarkable. He didn't perform a clinical transfer, the kind that medical staff did dozens of times a day, treating it like a routine procedure. Instead, he lifted Princess Mira the way you might help a family member, the way an older brother might carry a younger sister who'd fallen asleep during a long trip home. There was gentleness in his movements and respect, and a fundamental acknowledgement of her dignity as a person. He carried her to a quiet corner of the restaurant, a spot where they could still see the celebration through the transparent wall, but had enough space to move without bumping into furniture or other guests. The music from the hall was still audible, a gentle rhythm that seemed to pulse through the air itself. And then Tyler began to sway, just a gentle rocking motion at first, moving in time with the distant music. He held Princess Mira securely, but not tightly, supporting her weight completely, while making it seem effortless. "Dancing is about feeling free," Tyler murmured, his voice soft enough that only Mira and the nearby Empress could hear. "It's not about the steps or the technique. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself. It's about letting go of everything else and just experiencing joy for its own sake." He began to move more deliberately, taking small steps, turning slowly in a careful circle. Each movement was smooth and controlled, ensuring that Mira felt safe while still experiencing the sensation of motion, of flying, of dancing. Princess Myra's breathing had changed completely. Her eyes were half closed, her face relaxed in a way it never was normally. And then something miraculous happened. She began to hum. The sound was broken and imperfect, her vocal cords struggling to produce the notes. But it was music, genuine music, coming from someone who rarely made any sound at all. And then she laughed. It was a brief sound, barely more than a few seconds long. But it was real laughter, pure and unfiltered, the sound of complete joy. That laugh shattered something deep inside Empress Thera. Tears began streaming down her face, hot and unstoppable. In Valkorian culture, crying in public was seen as a serious loss of control, a display of weakness that no leader should ever show. No one had seen their Empress cry in 3 decades of rule. But she couldn't stop. Her daughter was laughing. Her daughter was happy. Her daughter was dancing. For 5 perfect minutes. Princess Mira wasn't a disabled princess or a political liability or a medical condition. She was just a young woman experiencing something beautiful and pure. She was dancing, held safely in the arms of a kind stranger who saw her as a person worth celebrating. When Tyler finally, gently, returned Mira to her chair and secured the restraints once more, the princess was glowing. Her face was flushed with exhausted happiness, her eyes bright with emotion. She looked more alive than the Empress had seen her in years. Empress Thera couldn't speak. Words had completely failed her. She could only stare at this ordinary human waiter who had just accomplished something extraordinary. He had given her daughter something that an entire empire, with all its resources and technology and medical expertise, had never been able to provide. He had given her a moment of normalcy, a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. And in doing so, he had changed everything. The diplomatic dinner had officially ended. The other guests were preparing to leave, gathering their belongings and saying their polite goodbyes. The Velcorian delegation was organizing themselves for the return trip to the flagship. Everything was returning to normal protocol and procedure. But Empress Thera had other plans. "Walk with me," she commanded Tyler, her voice cutting through the general noise of departure. The response was immediate and dramatic. Her advisors erupted in protest, their voices rising in alarm. This was highly irregular, dangerous, even. The Empress should not be alone with an unknown human, especially one who had already breached protocol multiple times during the evening. Security concerns alone made this request unacceptable. But Empress Thera simply raised one hand, and the protest died instantly. That single gesture carried the weight of absolute authority. When she made a decision, it was final. Her advisors knew better than to push further. She turned to Tyler and gestured toward a corridor, leading away from the restaurant. He nodded and followed without hesitation, seemingly unbothered by the significance of what was happening. Two of her guards moved to follow at a discreet distance, their presence a compromise between security and privacy. They walked through the station's corridors in silence, the Empress leading the way with the confident stride of someone who always knew where she was going. Eventually, they arrived at one of the observation decks, a large room with floor-to-ceiling transparent walls that offered an unobstructed view of space. And there, rotating slowly in the void below them, was Earth. The blue planet looked peaceful from this distance. White clouds swirled across its surface. Vast oceans reflected the light of the sun. Continents were visible as brown and green masses interrupting the endless blue. It was a beautiful world, vibrant and alive in a way that many planets weren't. Tyler stood beside the Empress, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He gazed at his homeworld with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had seen it many times but still appreciated its beauty. There was no fear in his posture, no tension in his shoulders. Most beings who stood next to Empress Thera displayed some level of nervousness, some recognition of the danger inherent in being close to someone so powerful. But Tyler just looked relaxed, patient, waiting for her to speak when she was ready. The silence stretched between them for a long moment. Finally, Empress Thera asked a question that had been burning in her mind all evening. "Why did you do that?" Her voice was quiet but intense. "Why risk offending my entire empire? You could have been arrested. You could have caused a diplomatic incident. Why show such kindness to someone you'll never see again?" Tyler turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. Then he shrugged, a very human gesture that somehow conveyed both simplicity and profound meaning. "Because she's a person," he said simply, "and persons deserve moments of joy. It's really that simple." "Nothing is that simple," Empress Thera replied sharply. Tyler smiled, not mockingly but with gentle understanding. "Maybe that's your problem," he said softly. The Empress bristled at that comment, her posture stiffening. For a moment, anger flashed across her features. How dare this common human suggest that she had a problem? But then she caught herself. She forced her shoulders to relax, took a deep breath, and let the anger drain away. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, more vulnerable. "My council wants me to send Mira away," she confessed, the words tumbling out as if they'd been trapped inside her for too long. "To a medical facility, somewhere on the edge of our territory. They say she'll be comfortable there. They say she'll receive the best care. But we both know what they really mean. They want her forgotten, hidden, erased from public view." She paused, staring down at Earth as if the planet might somehow have answers for her. They say she weakens the royal bloodline. They say that compassion is inefficiency, that resources spent on those who can't contribute to the empire are resources wasted. They have charts and data and logical arguments. Her voice cracked slightly, and I was starting to believe them. I was starting to think that maybe they were right, that maybe the best thing for everyone would be to just let her go. Tyler didn't respond immediately. He stood quietly, absorbing what she'd said, giving her confession the weight and respect it deserved. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured. "You know, Earth almost destroyed itself once," he began. "We had the same idea your council has. We built entire societies around the concept that efficiency mattered more than compassion, that strength meant eliminating weakness, that the strong had no obligation to the weak. What changed?" the Empress asked, genuinely curious. "We almost went extinct," Tyler said simply. "We fought wars that nearly ended all life on the planet. We poisoned our own air and water. We created weapons that could turn our whole world into a lifeless rock. And in our darkest moment, when we were staring into the abyss of our own destruction, we finally understood something important." He turned to face her directly, his eyes serious. "Our strength didn't come from being perfect. It didn't come from eliminating everyone who was different or struggled or needed help. Our strength came from protecting each other, especially those who needed protection most. We learned that civilization that can't make space for everyone isn't strong at all. It's brittle. And brittle things break when pressure is applied." The Empress looked down at Earth again, seeing it with new eyes. This world of imperfect, emotional, chaotic humans who somehow survived everything the universe threw at them, who had nearly destroyed themselves but found a way back, who had built a civilization based on principles that her own empire considered weaknesses. "You're saying compassion is strategic?" she asked, trying to understand. Tyler smiled again, that warm, genuine smile that seemed to come so easily to him. "I'm saying compassion is everything. Without it, what are you even building an empire for? What's the point of ruling 17 star systems if you can't make one girl smile? What's the point of all that power if it doesn't make anyone's life better?" Empress Thera had no answer to that question. She stood in silence, watching Earth rotate slowly below, feeling the weight of centuries of tradition and culture pressing down on her shoulders. Everything she'd been taught, everything her civilization believed, was being challenged by the simple words of a human waiter. But for the first time in years, possibly for the first time in her entire reign, she knew what she needed to do. The path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, possibly even rebellion, but she had seen her daughter laugh. She had witnessed joy where she thought none was possible. And that changed everything. 3 months had passed since that dinner on Harmony's Gate. 3 months since Empress Thera watched her daughter dance for the first time. 3 months since a human waiter had shown her something that shook the foundations of everything she believed. Now she stood in the Grand Council Chamber on the Velcorian homeworld, facing the most powerful beings in her empire. The chamber was ancient, its walls carved from solid stone thousands of years ago. Hundreds of council members sat in tiered rows, their silver faces impassive, waiting to hear why their empress had called this emergency session. Empress Thera stood at the center of the chamber, alone. She held a small device in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. Then she pressed a button. The sound of Princess Myra's laughter filled the enormous space. It echoed off the ancient stone walls, clear and joyful and utterly unexpected. Most of the council members had never heard the princess make any sound at all, let alone laugh with such pure happiness. The recording lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds felt like an eternity. When the laughter faded into silence, Empress Thera spoke. Her voice was strong and clear, carrying to every corner of the chamber. "This is the sound of my daughter experiencing joy. A human waiter gave her this gift in 5 minutes. Our entire empire, with all its resources and all its expertise, couldn't manage it in 15 years. That should terrify us." The chamber erupted. Council members jumped to their feet, shouting over each other. Some demanded explanations. Others called for her abdication, claiming she had gone mad. Several of the more conservative members called for military action against humanity, accusing them of somehow corrupting their Empress with psychological manipulation. But Empress Thera stood firm, waiting for the chaos to subside. Eventually, the noise died down, and she continued. "I am issuing an imperial decree, effective immediately," she announced. "Princess Mira remains my heir, and any discussion of removing her from the line of succession is now forbidden. Furthermore, we will establish full rights for disabled citizens across all Valkorian worlds. Medical facilities will be reformed. Public access will be mandated. Discrimination will be criminalized." The chamber exploded again, even louder than before. But Thera raised her voice over the noise. "We will also begin cultural exchange programs with humanity, not to study their weapons or their technology. We will learn how they build societies that value every life, how they create systems that protect the vulnerable instead of eliminating them." The vote that followed was the closest in Valkorian history. It passed by a margin of only 7 votes out of more than 300 cast. Several star systems immediately threatened to secede from the Empire. Conservative factions organized protests and demonstrations. Within the first month alone, there were 3 separate assassination attempts on the Empress's life. But something unexpected happened as the decree began to be implemented. Support came from places no one anticipated. Young Valkorians who had been hiding disabilities stepped forward, finally able to live openly. Families who had been secretly caring for children they were supposed to have sent away came out of the shadows. Citizens who had been exhausted from pretending to be emotionless, from maintaining the perfect facade that Valkorian culture demanded, spoke up about their struggles. They had been waiting, sometimes for decades, for someone in power to say that compassion wasn't weakness, that needing help didn't make you worthless, that being different didn't mean you had to be hidden. The movement grew faster than anyone predicted. What started as a controversial decree became something much larger, a cultural shift that swept across the empire like a wave. 1 year later, Empress Thera and Princess Mira returned to Harmony's Gate. The station had transformed dramatically in that time. Where once it had been primarily a place for trade negotiations and diplomatic meetings, it now hosted cultural exchanges from dozens of different civilizations. The original restaurant section had expanded, growing into an entire district dedicated to experiencing different cultures through food, art, and music. Tyler's small restaurant had grown along with everything else. What had started as a simple dining establishment had become something much more significant. It was now a place where beings from across the galaxy came not just to eat, but to experience what human culture really meant, to understand the principles that allowed humanity to thrive despite all their imperfections. Tonight, Tyler had reserved the entire restaurant for a special event, adaptive dancing night. He called it. The space had been modified with special equipment, wider pathways, supportive rails, and dozens of other accommodations. And the guests were arriving. Valkorian families walked through the doors, many of them bringing disabled children openly for the first time in their lives. Something that would have been considered shameful just a year ago was now celebrated. Parents who had been hiding their children away were now proudly introducing them to others, sharing their stories, finding community. Princess Mira was among them, but she looked completely different from the silent girl in the mobility chair from a year ago. Human engineers had worked with Valkorian medical experts to design advanced mobility aids specifically for her condition. She wore a sophisticated exoskeleton that provided support while still allowing her natural movement. Her communication had improved dramatically thanks to new therapies that combined human and Valkorian techniques. But more than the technology, what had changed was her confidence. She moved through the crowd with her head held high, stopping to talk with other young Valkorians, introducing herself, making friends. She had a life now, a real life beyond medical facilities and isolation. Empress Thera found Tyler in the kitchen, supervising the evening's preparations. When he saw her, he smiled that same warm smile from a year ago. "Thank you," the Empress said quietly. "You change an empire." Tyler shook his head, still smiling. "I didn't change anything. I just reminded you that every life has value. You did the hard part. You actually believed it, and then you had the courage to act on that belief. That was all you." The Empress watched through the kitchen doorway as her daughter laughed with a group of other teenagers, all of them with different abilities. All of them accepted and celebrated. Music played in the background, and several families were already dancing together. She thought about humanity's strange power. They weren't the strongest species in the galaxy. They weren't the most technologically advanced. They didn't have the largest empire or the most formidable military. But they had something more important. They had a stubborn, irrational, beautiful insistence that every person mattered. That compassion wasn't a weakness to be eliminated, but the very foundation of civilization itself. They believed it so deeply that they built their entire society around that principle, even when it would have been easier, more efficient to do otherwise. And sometimes, all it took to change an empire was one person choosing kindness when cruelty would have been easier. One person treating another person with dignity and respect, regardless of the rules or the risks. The music played on, and for the first time in her long reign, Empress Thera truly understood what humans meant when they talked about their greatest strength. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about never making mistakes or never struggling. It was about being human, about caring for each other, especially when it was difficult, about building something better, one small act of kindness at a time.